How y'all doing? All right?
All right.
Yes, ready for the final episode of Cool Blue? This is outrageous, honestly. I'm even a little reluctant to tell this episode. I am every year because surely your opinion of me will change radically.
Never.
No, I'm honest. I'm going to be honest. I'm going to be honest in this story, and I do things that I can only admit to now that I'm an older man and I don't do these kinds of things anymore, seriously. You possibly remember I moved forward at the end of Bull Deckhand, and George and I put together Cool Blue, our new accommodations, our new room. Put together Cool Blue in the third episode. Rachel, I think you missed that one, huh? I'm heartbroken to know that.
You're not going to give like a little recap?
It's on YouTube.
Not yet.
We'll be appearing soon, but essentially what happened, Rachel, is I moved forward. We still didn't have air conditioning, and it's a coal boat, and the coal dust is blowing through the porthole, and so we get an air conditioner and go through everything that it takes to finally make it work, and then Blue is every bit as fantastic as we ever dreamed it to be. We painted it and furnished it, and it became our asylum. It became our sanctuary on the boat. To finally make it work, we could not. The porthole was round and the air conditioner was square, and the air conditioner was slightly larger than the porthole, and so we had to mount it in the door, which George had managed to find down below in the bowels of the ship. He found a wooden door, and he fitted it to the frame, and he cut a hole in the top portion, and he put the air conditioner up there. When the chief engineer found out what had happened to his door, yes, that's who that wooden door belonged to. He had stored it down in the ship so that he could take his screen door off when the weather started to turn cold. He could take it off and he could put the wooden door on his room in its place. When he discovered that it was his door that had been readapted to accommodate an air conditioner and was now in two pieces, one of which had about an 18-inch square hole cut in it, he was irate. He went to the captain, and as scuttlebutt would have it, do you know what scuttlebutt is? On a ship, it's rumor or gossip, right? As scuttlebutt would have it, he went to the old man, to the captain, and he complained. And the captain didn't do anything about it. The captain, in fact, scoffed at it. He said, well, go reclaim your door if you'll want it. And I think he even found a little humor in that. So the chief engineer was plenty angry, and he vented his spleen, yes, by fomenting more animosity than ever that already existed between the deck department and the engine crew.
Y'all was beefing.
Would you say what?
Y'all was beefing.
Beefing? I suspect there is, people like to think of a boat as being one big, hi Sarah, glad you made it. They like to think of a ship or a boat as being one big happy family. Banish the thought. A family it might be. Happy? What family is ever happy? I had a Greek lit professor at college who was fond of saying that all tragedy is a family affair. Yes, interesting when you think about Oedipus or Orestes or any of those things, right? he fomented that animosity. There's always rivalry, just like in a family, sibling rivalry, whatever. There's always competitiveness, who's doing better. Deck department's better than the engine crew. No, the engine crew's better than the deck department. That's just the natural state of things. But the chief engineer fomented more animosity than ever because he was genuinely angered about what had happened to his door. About this time, we got a new crew member. And he came with a rating and a college education. He was an able-bodied seaman, an AB seaman, and he was a wrestler when he was in college, and he had majored in psychology. He was about 6 years older, I believe, 6 years, 8 years older than George, and a couple years younger than I. And he was still in remarkably good shape. He had wrestled in one of the middleweight categories, and he had only gained a couple of pounds since college. He was still very much an athlete. There was a great deal about him that one could like. But unfortunately, he was very OCD and full of neuroses. He was crazy as a loon. And he liked to psychoanalyze everybody on the crew. I think he did it as a kind of defense mechanism. Do you know what I mean? He would psychoanalyze them. He would psychoanalyze himself, but never out loud. He was probably his own worst enemy. And he suffered, I believe, from trichotillomania. Do you know what that is? Yes. Good for you, Katie. I'm going to make an attempt to spell this. Trichotillomania. He suffered from that, and he was just about bald. He was worrying about losing his hair, and so he would constantly reach up there to see if it was still there, and while he was pulling on it to make sure it was still firmly rooted, he would pull a few hairs out at that time. Sometimes I think hands full at a time. Yes, it's a terrible ailment. I think he suffered from it. He was highly contentious. Half of the crew was from Green Bay. Most of them were in the engine crew, and the other half of the crew was from South and East Chicago. So the Chicago bunch were Bear fans, and the Green Bay bunch were Packer fans. And all through the fall, they argued over which team was better. Mark, our new watchman, came from Ashtabula, which was just outside of Cleveland. He was a Browns fan. I was from Cincinnati. I guess that should have made me a Bengals fan if I would have cared anything about football. But Mark was highly contentious, and he enjoyed the fact that everybody else was supporting a different team from him because it gave him an ample crowd to argue with. He'd come in our room and just without even knocking, he kind of visited us like you guys don't remember unless from Nickelodeon, Captain Kangaroo and Mr. Green Jeans. Does anybody remember such a thing? Captain Kangaroo, Mr. Green Jeans would just drop in on him, barge in. And that's kind of what Mark would do. He knew we kind of liked him, but he just took great liberties. He'd come in and flop down in the lazy boy, stroke his washboard abs and tug on his hair, and complain about members of the crew. There was also a guy named Stroke. His name was actually William Kunsel. He was the deck mechanic. His job was to take care of the winches on the deck, but he actually was with the engine crew. That's the group that he really worked with and worked for. He also was suffering from premature baldness, but I don't think he had trichotillomania trichotillomania. He was about 35 and looked about 10 years older. He was a tremendous worker, though. He knew the work, and he was uncommonly strong and very short-fused. He was magnificently short-tempered. He would snap at a moment's notice, and a cable would be jammed in a winch, and that would just set him off. And he'd grab that cable and wrench it out. He might beat on the winch with a crescent wrench. He was on a short fuse. At any rate, Mark, who was still pretty much an athlete, brought a lot of gear with him. When it got to be really cold, he had a ski outfit that he would wear, and it was a little more upscale than anything that guys on the boat were used to. Can you imagine? He had all this form-fitted ski gear, including a ski mask. And when he would wear that stuff, he'd look a little bit out of place, kind of like a guy on a hunting expedition wearing a tuxedo. We by contrast, were wearing Carhartts and those kind of Russian caps with the earmuffs you'd pull down. The motley that you would assemble to try to stay warm in very, very cold weather. But it's still summertime, and Mark has brought on board, in addition to his ski outfit, he brought on board a racing bicycle, and it was a nice one. And he would wait on days when we would get to port and have he'd have his entire watch off, and he might go for a 4 or 6 hour bike ride. The first time he did that, he borrowed a crescent wrench from the engine room. I'm not sure if he asked for permission or if he just went down and got one for himself. But he didn't have any place to put it because he was wearing spandex bike riding shorts. I think the kind that had the padded seat in them. Do you know what I mean? And he didn't have anywhere to put, he didn't have any pockets to put the wrench. So he wired it to the seat of his bicycle. He had this wrench so that he could adjust the seat and he could adjust the gears and handlebars, whatever he needed to do. He wired it to the seat of his bicycle, and he took a long ride. We were down in Gary, Indiana, in a place that we seldom went to, and he got back just seconds before we cast off and left. And so we were pulling his bicycle up with a line, and he was climbing the ladder as the boat was pulling away. And he had to go on watch immediately, so he didn't have time to return the wrench. In fact, I think he stood his watch in his spandex. I had finished my watch. I'd gone to bed and just to take a nap. It was around supper hour, and George came back early and said, "Wake up, Rip," as if my last name was Van Winkle. He said, "Wake up, Rip, you're not going to believe what just happened." I said, "Yeah, what was that?" He said, "Man, we're back at dinner, and Stroke accused Mark of stealing the engine room's wrench." Just about the time he had said that, in flies the door flies open, Mark flops down in the lazy boy, stroking his abs, pulling on his hair, and he says, "Man, oh man, did you hear?" He's talking primarily to George because George had witnessed it. He said, "Did you hear what that guy said to me? He accused me of stealing his wrench." He says, "I'll show him. I'm going to take my sweet time about returning it now." Oh, man. I said, "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Mark. You know Stroke's on a short fuse." Man, he didn't care. He'd been a wrestler in college. He said, I'm not backing up for Stroke. He's no problem for me." When he left, I heard George chortling in the bunk below, and I looked over the edge and asked him, what are you thinking? And he said, I was just thinking, can you imagine what would happen if Mark's bicycle came up missing? And I laughed. I said, sure, that's a no-brainer, right? I said, he's going to think Stroke hit it. And then George laughed and said, that's right. I said, yeah, but where are you going to hide? Where are you going to hide a bicycle on a ship, man? He'll find it in no time. George laughed again, and I looked back over the bunk, and he had this devious smile on his face. And I said, oh, no, George. You're not thinking what I think you're thinking. And he was. That night on the run up to Milwaukee, we hid Mark's bicycle in Davy Jones's locker. Kerplunk. We did. I told you I didn't want to tell this story. Kerplunk. Guys, just like the lockers, that bike went down. Now, to my amazement, I mean, lightweight frame, inflated tires. I thought, man, oh man, we should have tied an anchor to this thing. It'll be floating on the surface. Somebody will find it. Nah, it went down fast. Bike was stowed in Davy Jones's locker. Well, it took longer than I would have ever imagined for Mark to miss it. He had stowed that bike in the utility room across from Blue. And he didn't have occasion to use it, so he never ever looked in on it. I guess he just figured it was there and the wrench was still hanging from the back of the bicycle seat. The wrench, by the way, was now with Davy Jones, too. We waited. We couldn't wait for when he finally did miss his bicycle. We waited and waited and waited. Because we needed a day when we were going to get to port precisely when Mark was going to be free and have his whole watch off, and he was going to have a nice weather and it would be daytime. I think we waited for over 2 weeks. That was just about the longest 2 weeks of my life personally. But the anticipation was building. George was calculating from the time we would leave port, what time we would get to Chicago or Milwaukee. He'd check the weather forecast, and we'd try to figure out whether or not this might be the day that Mark would go for a spin. And miss after miss after miss. And then finally, it happened. We got to port. The door of Blue flew open. Mark storms in, unannounced, of course, and says, he's got it. George said, got what? Mark said, my bicycle. My bicycle's missing. He's got it. And George said, who's got it? And Mark looked at us like we were both nuts. He said, Stroke's got it. Who else would? George said, relax, Mark, relax. Most he could have done is hit it. We'll find it. George took us around the boat. I helped. We went everywhere in that boat looking for Mark's bicycle. George introduced us to places on the ship that I had no idea existed. And I am sorry to report that the bicycle was nowhere to be found. Meanwhile, Mark has got breaking and entering on his mind because he's absolutely certain that Stroke's got it in his room. That evening at supper, apparently, Mark went back and got right in Stroke's face and said, okay, where is it? And Stroke says, where's what? And get out of my face. And Mark said, my bicycle, don't play dumb with me. And Stroke says, I don't know what the hell you're talking about. And George said, I believe they'd have gone to Fifth City if there hadn't been about 6 of us there to hold them apart. George said, you know that little red wagon that Stroke uses to haul around his tools when he works on the winches? He had this little American Flyer wagon. And the winches were big. There were wrenches that would come up to your chin. You'd have to work on hardware, on nuts on that winch that were as big as a softball is round, right? And you'd have wrenches that were come up like this. They're heavy as a concrete block, man, and steel. And you'd have to tighten those nuts, loosen them up. He had all these tools piled into this wagon, and he would service about 6-8 winches on the deck every day. Tools were very, very heavy and awkward to carry around, so he stowed them in a little red wagon like a child and pulled it up and down the deck. George says, can you imagine what would happen if Stroke's wagon came up missing? I said, yeah, that's a no-brainer. George, you're not thinking what I think you're thinking. And he was. That night, on the way to Milwaukee, we stowed Stroke's wagon in Davy Jones's locker. Tools and all. Kerplunk! That sucker was so heavy. I wish I could explain that. Why are y'all doing this? Is that what you said, Naya? Huh? Who said that? Willow? I wish I could explain that. I think the only thing I can say, boredom. Boredom, it just made the time pass so much more pleasantly. That wagon was so heavy. Sarah, that wagon was so heavy it took both of us to lift that sucker up, and when it went overboard, it went over like an anchor. My goodness, it went down so fast I couldn't believe it. It didn't take Stroke 2 weeks to miss his wagon. Right after breakfast, every morning, it's the first thing he went for. And when he went for his wagon in a utility room in the after quarters, it wasn't there. And there was no doubt whatsoever in his mind what had happened to it. And we were approaching Milwaukee, and we were about to make the landing, and we were going to have to change the boom swings because we were going to unload on the opposite side. So all the deckhands were out, and we were up on the front end, and here comes Stroke charging up the deck. It's sunrise. Here comes Stroke charging up the deck, and Mark is sitting on the bleacher that you climb onto when you get on the landing chair to go off and put the lines ashore. Mark's sitting there, and here comes Stroke, and Stroke is right in his face and says, "Where is it?" And Stroke says, "Where's what?" Mark says, "Where's what?" And Stroke says, "Don't play dumb with me. You know what I'm talking about." And Mark said, "Get out of my face." And Stroke says, "Don't give me any bleep. Spandex. What'd you do with it?" And I believe that they would have gone to Fifth City right then and there. But George was out on the deck with his Kodak, and he was taking pictures of the sunrise. Now, there's something about a Kodak moment that takes you out of the picture in the very second that you're in it. George was snapping pictures of the sunset, and just as casually, he switched over and started snapping pictures of the two of them. And at one moment, they realized that they were the subject of this photography session, and they interrupted their argument to look to see What are you doing? And George said, you guys are like a couple of kids, man, hiding each other's toys. Like, Stroke, give Mark his bicycle back, and Mark, give Stroke his wagon back, and let bygones be bygones. Click, click. And everybody in the crew who at first was kind of in the mood to see what was going to happen was now in the mood to see hatchets buried and everything nice again. And they joined in with George. Yeah, let bygones be bygones. And in the meantime, the captain's shouting down, have you started to change those boom swings yet? And that defused the fight again. Nobody ever really knew what happened to the wagon or what happened to the bicycle. There was just bad blood and trouble brewing. It was the first of many mysteries that season. And would you like to see the picture of it? This is amongst the pictures. This is, I think, my personal favorite. This is Stroke right here, and Mark on the bench, and that shadow right there with a camera in his hand. That's George, yes, taking the picture. And that, my friends, is Davy Jones's Locker and the story of Cool Blue. Thank you. Thank you.